There's a voice inside us that we don't hear, but we feel it. It doesn't need sound to tell us, you're not enough. You should have done more. Why can't you just be better? That's exactly what this video is about, because this voice isn't random. It has a history, and it doesn't start in adulthood, but often much earlier, in rooms where nobody shouted, but nobody listened either. Welcome to PaperLoud. This is part 1 of our 2-part report on the inner critic. Today we'll show where it comes from and why lack of self-worth is the breeding ground for almost everything that sabotages us from within. Chapter 1. How the voice is born. What we think about ourselves is often not the result of reflection, but an echo. An echo from childhood, from looks, words, reactions. Psychologically, the inner critic develops through a complex combination of internalization, shame, guilt, and survival mechanisms. Particularly powerful are what psychologists call internalized evaluations, statements from others that we adopt as truth. You're too loud. You'll never manage that. Pull yourself together. These statements aren't questioned. They turn into beliefs. Children need belonging. To achieve that, they learn how to be, or more precisely, how not to be. One wrong tone, one bad grade, and suddenly love is on the line. The child learns, if I perform, I'm safe. If I make mistakes, it gets quiet or loud, but not loving. Regular negative feedback gets internalized as truth about the self and becomes beliefs like, I'm not good enough. Many kids grow up in systems that value performance over relationship. The grade gets commented on, not the effort. Weakness is overlooked, not understood. This creates an inner voice that warns, corrects, devalues. Be perfect, then nothing bad will happen. I was the quiet kid who worked, who didn't cause trouble. And at some point, I started believing that this was what made me valuable, being quiet, being strong, being good. These mechanisms run deep because they aren't conscious. A child doesn't reflect, my parents are overwhelmed. It thinks, I'm wrong. And that's where the vicious cycle begins. Another central factor is attachment. From attachment theory, children develop an inner working model of how the world works based on how their caregivers treat them. If that bond is insecure or even avoidant, an inner critic often forms that tries to create safety through control. If I'm perfect, I can stay. That's not a character flaw, that's survival strategy. This critic is not the evil inside us. It's a relic, a form of protection, but one that keeps us small in adult life, because we've learned our worth doesn't lie in being, but in performing. Society as an amplifier, why you feel not enough even when you succeed. Imagine your inner critic had a megaphone and society was the amplifier. That's how it feels to constantly function and never be enough. You walk through daily life and everywhere it's written who you're supposed to be. Efficient, optimistic, successful, but please, authentic while you're at it. While you try to live up to this ideal, you don't even notice you've lost yourself. In a performance-driven society, self-worth gets externalized, pushed outward. Success, productivity, adaptation, that becomes the yardstick. But psychologically, this is dangerous. When worth is defined only by performance, a fragile self-image forms. You become dependent on recognition and at the same time immune to it, because every bit of validation is only valid until you have to prove yourself again. Especially bitter, success doesn't heal the deficit. On the contrary, it hides it. Because when you function, few ask how you're really doing. You're doing great, right? What could be missing? So you tell yourself, I have no reason to feel this way. Pull yourself together. Others have it worse. And again, the voice returns. The old, harsh one. You're not enough. I used to think if I just did everything right, it would stop. The restlessness, the shame. But it never went away. It only got quieter when others clapped. Another factor is social comparison. Studies show people with insecure self-worth react more strongly to comparisons, especially negatively. Social media amplifies this massively. What you see are successes, filters, perfection. What you don't see are doubts, failures, humanity. The result? A constant feeling of being behind, and the inner critic grabs that and uses it as proof. You're slower, worse, incapable. The role of education. The education system adds to it. Those who learn that a grade says more about the person than the learning process don't develop confidence but self-surveillance. One single mistake and the whole structure collapses. And then you grow older and notice it doesn't stop. It just changes form. Yesterday it was math class, today it's your job, your relationship, your body. Psychology talks about chronic self-worth deficit, a state where people can't build a stable self-image despite objective success. They function, they meet expectations, but inside, insecurity rules. This gap often leads to burnout, exhaustion, or depression because the inner critic is never satisfied and because no one ever learned how to silence it. When functioning becomes survival. If you don't feel enough despite recognition, the problem isn't you. The problem is your self-worth never grew without conditions. When functioning becomes survival, people call you reliable. You're always there, always available. But sometimes those are exactly the people who have lost themselves the most. They say, that's just how I am. I can't say no. I like making others happy. But what they don't say is how tired they are, how empty, how loud the critic gets when nobody's watching. The truth is, many of us never learned how to exist without pleasing. We weren't asked, how do you feel, but do you obey? Not what do you need, but what's wrong with you. And so life becomes, I function, therefore I am. But that comes with the cost, because those who constantly adapt eventually forget where their own boundary begins and where it's crossed. Psychologically, that's not a flaw, but another survival pattern. Many call it people-pleasing, but behind it is something deeper, the fear of no longer being loved if you show yourself as you are. And the critic applauds because you did everything right again, but you feel nothing or only this, exhaustion, not the physical kind, but the silence that comes when you've lived against yourself for too long. Because if you never show yourself, no one can see you. And if you never set boundaries, everyone can step over you. The fatal part? You often notice too late because you never learn that your needs matter or even exist. In psychology, this is called loss of self-worth through external adaptation. A person no longer lives from within, but only reacts to demands, to looks, to expectations. And the self? It gets quieter and quieter until one day you almost don't hear it anymore. You can do everything right and still lose yourself because the inner critic doesn't want you to be you. It wants you to fit. But that's not life. That's a silent retreat from yourself and the beginning of the end of any honest connection with yourself. The roots of the deficit. There are families where nobody shouts, yet the air is full of fear. There are mothers who do everything and children who still feel unloved. There are fathers who are proud and yet never truly see who their child really is. Self-worth doesn't come from success. It comes from mirroring, from sentences like, I see you, you are important, you don't need to achieve anything to be loved. And when those mirrors are missing, something stays empty, invisible but felt. Many adults today walk around with this hole, a lack of self-worth, not because they failed, but because no one was there to show them they were enough as human beings. In psychology, we call this emotional neglect, invisible but powerful influence on self-worth. It's not about violence or abuse in the classic sense, but about what's missing: resonance, attention, emotional presence. When those are absent, no stable self-image develops. Instead, an identity forms that constantly asks, am I right? And never finds the answer on its own. That's how toxic shame arises. Not the healthy, fleeting kind that helps us navigate socially, but the deep conviction, I am wrong, I am too much, I am not enough. And at some point, this shame becomes identity, the lens through which you see the world and yourself. The critic as a symptom. The inner critic is not the problem, it's the symptom. The real problem is you never learn to experience yourself as valuable without conditions. And so what starts as a childhood without mirrors turns into an adulthood without anchor, without ground, without an inner voice saying you are allowed to be. But that's the beginning, because what was learned can be unlearned, and what was never said can still be spoken. You are not wrong. You only learned to see yourself that way. Part 2 will show you how to change that view, not by fighting yourself, but by finally stopping abandoning yourself. If your toughest opponent sits in your head, you don't need an enemy outside, and you don't need guilt either. What you need is a new way of looking at yourself, and that starts now. Part 2 of this documentary goes live on Tuesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 4 p.m. in the UK and 5 p.m. in Central Europe. Make sure you're here when it drops. The Inner Critic, how to learn to stand on your own side. Stay honest, stay awake, stay loud. See you next time. Take care.